Very critical alert. I'm sure you know that the NIV was published by Zondervan and so on, and then it goes on and says that try to find these scriptures on your computer. They have removed 45 complete verses. And so you can go to Matthew 17:21 in the NIV and look. It is gone, but it's not. We can see there's a footnote, and here it says some manuscripts include here words similar to Mark 9:29. So I want to talk about why do translations differ? And it's not because modern translations are removing them and they're trying to hide. Rather, there are two main reasons. Either one, there are different manuscripts involved, and that's called textual criticism. Textual criticism looks at all the manuscripts we have of the Bible and tries to come to the original one, the original reading. And then two, it can be because a translation has a different philosophy, and so they just translate the passage in a different way. And so during this time, I'm going to try to show you how to know. So you have two translations before you. How do you figure out if it's a textual criticism difference versus if it's a translation philosophy difference? So we're going to start with textual criticism. So all the manuscripts that we have and examining those. So what we need to realize is that God uses us humans to preserve his word. So God's revelation didn't fall from heaven like the Book of Mormon, nor did God directly speak his word to a prophet, and that's exactly what we have. No. Um, God used humans, sometimes dictating, sometimes just using history in their words, and then it was collected, and then humans were then preserving it in different ways. And this isn't this isn't different or unusual about the way God works, because the final way God has revealed himself to us is through the incarnation, or the fullest way. God came down into human flesh, became a baby, was in a poor family, and so on. God uses the coarseness of humanity and gives us his revelation through that. God speaks through humans and uses humans to preserve his word. So the Old Testament was preserved mainly in the temple. So we can kind of see a picture of this when in 2 Kings 22 when Josiah sends his secretary to the high priest, and the high priest gives the secretary, he's like, hey, look what I found. I found the book of the law in the temple of the Lord. And then this sets a whole reformation, and Josiah is torn and repents and so on. But point being here, the Old Testament seems to be kept in the temple and preserved there. The New Testament is different. Uh, they're no longer centered around a temple or anything like that. So how it was preserved was something like we see in Colossians 4, where Paul says that to have this letter read, or after this letter has been read to you, see that it is also read in the church of the Laodiceans. Okay? So he sends this letter to Colossae, and they copy it, and then they go and they send it to Laodicea, and so on. And that's how letters were spread. They would be sent, and copied, and sent, and copied, and spread all over the world. And so okay. So now looking at the history of all this. So the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, and then eventually Hebrew fell out of the normal language use, and so no one could understand Hebrew. And so there were some Jews who translated it into Greek early on, around 200-ish BC, and then uh, and then during the time of the New Testament, Greek was the common language. But over time, Greek was no longer the common language, and since the New Testament was so focused on missionary, spreading to the ends of the world, they came to countries that had different languages. So they translated the Bible into tons of languages around the world, and even eventually in the Western Roman Empire, the language, the common language became Latin, and so Jerome, a scholar, translates the Bible into Latin, and this is called the Vulgate. He did that around 383 AD, and then that became the standard edition of the Western Church. Until Erasmus is a scholar in the 1500s who gathers together all the Greek manuscripts that he knows. And so he finds 7 manuscripts that none of them are earlier than the 11th century, but he uses those to make a Greek New Testament. And this is what we call the Textus Receptus. This is the text that's behind the King James and the New King James. And then several scholars after him updated his work or modified things. They had a few more manuscripts or whatever it was. But things changed significantly when in the 1700s onward there's lots of archaeology done. And a notable one here is this guy named Tischendorf, whom Indiana Jones is modeled after. But he finds this manuscript called Sinaiticus, which is the fullest, most complete, one of the most, probably the most reliable manuscript that we have of the whole New Testament, or most of the New Testament. And so in the late 1800s, Westcott and Hort switched the tide to follow readings more like the Sinaiticus and not the Textus Receptus because of all this archaeology that was found. And then also in the 1950s, the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, which changed a few readings here and there with our Old Testament. So we have archaeology of manuscripts for our New Testament, archaeology manuscripts for our Old Testament. Both of these are after the King James, right? King James is in the 1600s. So now there are 2 editions. The Nestle Aland is the standard edition today that follows for the New Testament, that uses all of these manuscripts found in archaeology. And the BHQ is the standard edition today, and it includes the Dead Sea Scrolls and the findings there. So after all this history and such, this is just a snapshot of all the different manuscripts and translations that we have. I'm not going to go through them all. New Testament, we also have thousands of manuscripts and translations, and even quotations from early church fathers and so on. So that's why translations will sometimes differ, because they're going to use a different reading from a different manuscript. So we're going to look at an example here. So Philemon 12. You come across in your reading, King James, whom I have sent again, thou therefore receive him. That is mine own bowels. And you see here, I've sent him to you, who is my very heart, back to you. There's no receive him here. So you ask, is this because of a manuscript difference, or what's going on here? One of the simplest ways in the New Testament to find if it's a manuscript difference with the King James is this. It's called the KJV Parallel Bible. So here's the text for Philemon. You just can search and look at your text, and it highlights the differences between, as the critical text over here, which is that Nestle Aland, and then the Textus Receptus over here that Erasmus put together. And we come to our verse in verse 12, and sure enough, here, thou therefore receive him is highlighted, and it's not highlighted over here. So we know that this is a textual criticism difference. There's a manuscript difference here. And how you can see why the NET didn't go with this reading, they have these footnotes here called TC, and that stands for textual criticism. So this is a textual criticism footnote. And you can see that they're here talking about the receive, and they talk about the motivations, why it might have been added, and they list here the different manuscripts that support the readings and so on, and they give you an explanation for why they've chosen the reading that they have. All right, an example in the Old Testament. So the KJV Parallel Bible is just for the New Testament. So the Old Testament, the NET footnotes are going to be the primary guide there. So here's an example of in Deuteronomy 32:8. It talks, the King James says that God set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of Israel. But then we see here the NET says heavenly assembly. And if we go down to the footnote here, we find the one that says textual TC for textual criticism. And so it says the Hebrew says the sons of Israel. But then what you'll see here is it talks about Qumran fragment has sons of God. Qumran is Dead Sea Scrolls. And also the Septuagint, the Greek translation reads angels of God. And so then they go on with an explanation about why they decided to translate it as heavenly assembly. But it's because of those new archaeology findings. And then they also give you here, if you're confused more, they'll give you a work that you can follow up on to look more into this topic. So, moral of the story, NET footnotes are going to help you a lot in understanding what difference is going on in the translation here, and especially for textual criticism. Okay, so that was the first one. The first was translations could differ because they're using different manuscripts, or even a different manuscript with different readings. Sometimes modern translations, even though they're using kind of the same base, they will have different readings because they decided to follow this manuscript instead of this one. And there's a whole bunch of different complicated theories on which one to use and stuff. But the NET will explain briefly all of those explanations. So, okay, so that's the first one, textual criticism, looking at the manuscripts. The second one is translations have differing philosophies. They have different goals for what they're trying to accomplish with their translation. So here's just a lot of things that translators have to consider. And so the first one here is word for word, whether they want to go word for word or whether they want to go thought for thought, meaning for meaning. Do they want to get what does each word mean and give you kind of the form of the Greek or the Hebrew, or do they want to follow more idiomatic English? The problem with going formal, going word for word, is that it won't be idiomatic English, and sometimes it can be misleading because there won't be a word for word equivalent from Greek to English or Hebrew to English. And then functional, the issue there is it's just by nature going to be more interpretive. You're going to have to trust the translator more than your own interpretations. But there's nothing wrong with each of them. They have just different goals. One wants to give you more the form of the text that was given to us in the original languages, and one wants to try to put it into good English. And so here is a scale from Fee and Strauss's book of kind of a spectrum of the translations and where they kind of fall on this word for word versus functional. Here's kind of my same idea. I've just kind of grouped them into more simple spots. But so that's the first one, is do they want to go word for word or do they want to go thought for thought? The second thing, major thing, is that translations have different goals for who they're translating for. So, are we translating for someone who has a religious background? Do they know what the words saints, justification, propitiation, expiatory, or sanctification even mean? Um, so, if a translation uses words like this, they are assuming that this is somebody that has a religious background or has the tools to go and understand these words. Where other translations aren't going to assume that. So like the NIRV and NLT are written at a very low reading level. Uh, and so they would be good for children or people with low reading levels. And so we can see here in Romans 3:25, the NIRV says that Jesus is a sacrifice to pay for sins, rather than using propitiation, which is used in the King James and the ESV. So here's a chart, the different reading levels. Just the point being that translations, some are easier to read than others. Other things to consider is there's times when the Greek or Hebrew is just ambiguous and there's no really good way to translate it into English. I'm not going to go through my examples, but and then another one here, clarification, is that sometimes if you translate the Greek or Hebrew literally or too strictly, it can be misleading. An example of this is in 1 John 3:6, like the NRSV, which is a more formal translation, says, "No one who abides in him sins," which can be misleading because if anyone's been a Christian for any amount of time, they know that we mess up at some point. And so the NIV explains that this is no one who abides in him, in Christ, keeps on sinning. Sinning is no longer a habit. It's no longer okay to live in sin. Your life needs to change. And so the NIV is just clarifying what John was intending to communicate. Another one is sensitivity. So King James talks about that he slew all the house of Bashan, he left no one that pisseth against the wall. And so, obviously, out of sensitivity, all other translations translate this as male, because that is what this is referring to. And then another one here is theology. This is kind of what that Prophecy Times Facebook post was warning us about. They're trying to say that modern translations they're trying to skew theology, which is not true. Very rarely are translation differences going to be on account of theology. So here's just a few examples. So this is in Matthew 19 about Jesus' teaching on divorce. He says, "Whoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery." In the NAB, which is a Catholic translation, it says that instead of fornication, it says, "unless the marriage is unlawful." Okay, now it's translated more specifically, this term, porneia, which the King James translates as fornication. It's a very general term, but the NAB, since they're Catholic, they don't believe that divorces can happen, so they're translating, or they're understanding that word as being an unlawful marriage instead of some sort of other sexual sin. Another example, in Romans 3:25, the King James translates it as propitiation, and the RSV translates it as expiation. So propitiation is something that appeases God, and the RSV they think that this is too of a pagan idea of God, so they translate it as expiation, which has to do with us being cleansed from our sin. But depending on how you understand this word, somebody could understand this word as expiation, and still hold to a propitiation idea, since it comes up in 1 John and in other places as well. So even here, yeah, there's a different theology difference, but this one word isn't going to change the entire meaning or theology of somebody. Um, Here's just I'll do this real quickly. Another one is this thing called the documentary hypothesis, and not to get into all the weeds, but it's pretty much that some people understand that the Old Testament was stitched together from different sources, and we can tell those sources in one way because of the way that God is referenced. So in Genesis 2, in verse 3, it says God blessed, and then here in verse 4, it says the Lord God. And so we can see here the NRSV splits their text here in between verse 4, and that's because they believe that these different names of God are making a break. Where the ESV is going to put verse 4 together because they don't follow the documentary hypothesis as much. So, and they also see this verse 4 as a poetic, following a chiasm here, and then also these are the generations, begins a narrative train throughout the entire book. But then you can also see the King James. They don't even have paragraphs. They just go verse by verse. And so this is kind of another thing that translations, modern translations now, will give you paragraphs and headings and stuff in order to make the text more readable. Where the King James doesn't break. It doesn't break for poetry. It doesn't break for paragraphs, and it also doesn't tell you when something is being quoted. There's no quotation marks. So that's just harder for us modern English people to then follow because we're used to all those things. So a quick digression on this is that even a translation of the Jehovah's Witnesses who are not orthodox in their theology, so you can see in John 1, they say that the word was a God. But even you go on and you read in John, and you have Thomas said to them, my Lord and my God, him being Jesus. So you can't really change this text. What a Jehovah's Witness will do is they'll explain that this my God isn't referring to Jesus, it's referring to God the Father. So it's really hard to skew the text and just make it say whatever you want. I mean, you can lowercase God, but that's about it. That, in general, translations are going to follow the text, and differences in theology aren't going to be because of the text, but it's going to be because of interpretations of the text. Another thing that translations will differ is their use of gender words. So King James ESV say, well, says the man, so they'll use masculine as kind of the default language, and that's kind of following Hebrew and Greek, which do the same thing, where NIV, NRSV, and other ones are going to try to make the language more neutral. So blessed is the one, and happy are those, and that's in order to follow idiomatic English a little better. Another one is tradition. So you can see all these translations in the Lord's Prayer say, hallowed be your name, but then NLT or NET don't follow the King James tradition as much, so they translate this as, may your name be kept holy, may your name be honored. Ancient terms, how do you translate ancient terms? Who knows what 6 cubits mean, and so on. We won't get into that. And lastly, style is like the NASB is more wooden, and it's not really meant to be read aloud. It's meant to just track word for word with the translation, where the King James and the ESV really tried hard to make their text readable out loud. So Which translation is best? Well, it just depends. What is your goal in using it? So we can't just say, this translation has one thing and this one has another. There's multiple things that go into a translation philosophy, a translation goal. And so something to just point out here. So as we saw, the King James is based off of the Textus Receptus, and it doesn't have any paragraphs or quotations or poetry markers. And the New King James also is based off of the Textus Receptus, but all the rest are going to be based off of the modern texts that take into account the archaeology that's been done. The NRSV has a translation of the Apocrypha, which is the books, Jewish works in between Malachi and Matthew that are in the Catholic Bible and the Eastern Orthodox Bible. And then the NAT has amazing footnotes that we already saw that can help us get a clue on translation differences or textual criticism differences. And the NLT is super easy to read. So they're going to differ in translation at times because of their different philosophies, their different goals for who they're writing to and why they're writing. So let's look at an example here. In Philemon 6, in the King James it says, that the communication of thy faith may become effectual. And we read in a lot of modern translations say, I pray that the faith you share with us may deepen your understanding. And so you can come here to the King James, or the KJV Parallel Bible, and you come to verse 6, and you notice, oh, there's nothing highlighted here. So it's probably not a textual criticism difference. There's probably not a different manuscript. So what is it? Well, you can see a footnote. NET has footnotes for this too. And as it explains here, the indicative I pray that was supplied in English in order to make this connection clear. Okay, so they're doing this because this term refers back to the idea of prayer. So the NET added I pray in order to make this text more clear. It's not as clear here in King James what this that is referring to. So that is why translations differ. And so just to summarize again, there's two reasons. It can be one, textual criticism reason. There's different manuscripts and different ways of analyzing and weighing the evidence in those manuscripts of what the original reading is. Or two, it could be because the translations have a different philosophy. They may want to clarify the text more or whatever it is. Translations have different goals for why they're translating.